Dr. Robert Rosen. Robyn Rosen, who is the humanities scholar for this project, is professor of history and women's studies at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. She earned her PhD from SUNY Binghamton in 1993 and her BA from Brandeis University in 1986. Professor Rosen has been recognized for her excellence as a teacher and was named Faculty of the Year in 1997. And in 2005, the Marist Board awarded her the Distinguished Teaching Award. Rosen teaches US history of the late 19th and 20th centuries, including courses related to race, understandings of manhood, and women's history. Her publications have focused on reproductive rights in the 20th century. She has also received an award for distinguished scholarship in 2009. Rosen has been a peer reviewer for a wide range of history journals, including the Journal of American History, Modern American History, and the Journal of Women's History, among others. In 2006 to 2007, Rosen directed a summer institute on teaching American history, funded by the US Department of Education. A resident of Pittsfield, Rosen has been a popular teacher for Ali and Temple Anshe Amunin. Oh, take it away, Dr. Rosen, it's all yours.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm so happy to be here. I'm the closer for this wonderful class. We've had an amazing 7 weeks, and I'm happy to start to talk today with you about the impact that suffrage had. So we've spent a bunch of weeks talking about how women got the vote, rethinking the suffrage movement, expanding to include other and new voices, thinking about tactics and politics. And so today I want us to think about what kind of impact that suffrage had immediately. And I'm going to try to tell you some stories that you might not know too well. I know Ollie is a tough crowd. You guys come into every class with a lot of knowledge. So the guiding questions we're going to work with today is, after 70 years of struggle, what was the appropriate business of former suffragists? Who would set the agenda? Could there be another unifying cause on the scale of suffrage? And what circumstances shaped the nature and impact of women's political activism after the ratification of the 19th Amendment? So I want to begin with sort of where we were on the verge of suffrage. And I divided this slide into the promise / threat, right? Because depending on which side you were on, you saw it as either a promise or a threat. And this is going to become important in what I'm going to be talking about today. So let's begin with the promise. What I mean by this is, what did suffragists themselves tell people was going to happen when women got the vote, right? And you see on the left, I wrote a few things down. They were predicting that there would be a women's voting bloc, right? That women would somehow, because of their similarities due to their gender, that they would sort of get together and make some noise in politics. In particular, they predicted that social welfare reform would be a primary goal of women, that they were going to get in there and clean up all this political corruption that was going on. And one of the big issues that they talked about very specifically was ending child labor. We're going to get back to that and talk a little bit about why women were interested in the things they were. Okay, but on the other side, the threat of suffrage, what was it that people were worried about? What did the anti-suffragists worry about? Well, one of the things they talked about was that, of course, women's political equality would bring marital unhappiness and divorce. It would upend gender roles. All these mothers who got involved in politics would become terrible mothers, and this would increase juvenile delinquency. And then the white racists argued that women's suffrage would be terrible for the Jim Crow South because it would bring in Black women voters, okay? So here's just a visual example of the promise and the threat. So I love the one on the left because it shows how much sort of ambition and excitement that suffragists represented when they talked about what a difference the world would be like if women could vote, right? And you see the pre-suffrage world on the left and the post-suffrage, sort of utopia on the right. And then, of course, this is on the right, the political cartoon you see is all about the threat of suffrage. And of course, the thing that this cartoonist was most worried about was that men might actually have to care for their children. So what actually did happen when we think about the new woman of the 1920s, and I have a few, happy flappers up there. What historians have mostly decided about suffrage, or there's a consensus that has developed, that it really didn't do as much as either its critics feared or its advocates promised. The generation immediately following World War I was so apolitical, in fact, that some former suffragists didn't even vote. And women's magazines ran stories with titles like, "Is women's suffrage a failure?" and "Women's suffrage declared a failure," right? So this is like a conversation that's going on in the 1920s. Basically, in a nutshell, this idea that the 19th Amendment was going to be a watershed, was going to change everything, turned out to be a very problematic one. One thing, of course, one reason for this was something that a lot of the historians in this course have talked about, was that it did not end up enabling Black women to vote in the South. And we're definitely going to be talking about that a little bit later. Second, it didn't drastically increase the number of women who voted in elections. Some of that is because, as Rebecca Edwards told us a few weeks ago, a lot of women were already voting when the 19th Amendment was ratified. And finally, it didn't create that gender gap in politics that allowed women to have a particular voice that was capable of significantly influencing American elections, right? So suffrage turned out to not be the sort of big deal in some ways that people had predicted. And so what I want to talk about today, and what we're going to examine, are the several sort of historical circumstances that undermined the impact of suffrage. I'm going to be talking today about competing ideologies among women themselves, and even beyond competing ideologies. In other words, people with just different views of what should happen next, but actual horizontal hostilities, where women were working against each other's interests. And then we're also going to be thinking about the impact of suffrage in terms of the external political circumstances. So we're going to be looking at feminism, conservatism, racism, and maternalism. Maternalism might be the only word that you're not as familiar with, but basically by maternalism, what I mean is a political position that accepts and even promotes gender differences and seeks to apply women's unique qualities to society at large. So I'm sure now that I've defined it, it will sound familiar to you. And we're going to be talking a lot about maternalism and maternalist politics today. Okay, so I want to begin with thinking about the new organizations that grew up right after suffrage and what happened to the suffragists. So the first new organization that we need to think about is the League of Women Voters. So this was what the National American Women's Suffrage Association turned into after ratification. Of course, you all know that the League of Women Voters is an organization that's still very important today, and it's still around. That it was begun by actually a Washington suffragist who wanted to get women who already had the vote to begin an organization to educate other women voters. And the League of Women Voters was created in January of 1920. And what's interesting about the League of Women Voters is that not all the women of the NASA agreed that this needed to be done. Some argued that now that suffrage was won, then NAWSA could just be disbanded, right? Others were concerned that an independent women's organization might actually take women out of political parties and partisan politics. So there were some women who thought, well, now that we've got the vote, let's go make an impact on party politics. But the League of Women Voters had a very different idea about that. They were determined to be nonpartisan, okay? And so they saw themselves as a voter education group. Others were a little nervous about the League of Women Voters because they were mindful of a growing conservative climate that was hostile to any form of feminism or really increasingly social justice reform. Some claimed that the existence of the League of Women Voters could cause conflict between men and women. And this is what enabled or inspired Carrie Chapman Catt, who we know from the suffrage movement and who then became involved in the establishment of the League of Women Voters, to assure her membership that we are not radicals, right? And so what we have, what I put up on the slide was a quote from Carrie Chapman Catt, which gives some idea of how the League of Women Voters was going to sort of pitch itself in this new climate, right? This organization was going to allow women to, quote, use their freedom to make their nation safer for their children and their children's children, right? And so that kind of language should sound extremely familiar to us, right? This is one of the ways, really the major way, that suffragists made arguments for their enfranchisement during the Progressive era. And this is an example of maternalist politics, right? Like what women are going to do, what we're going to contribute uniquely is a feminine perspective. And the things that we're going to care about are the safety and well-being of our children. Now, the League of Women Voters had a rival organization that began also right after suffrage. I mean, it was still the National Women's Party, which had been the more militant suffrage organization that they were the ones that picketed outside the White House, and they didn't change their name, but they were determined in the 1920s that now that the 19th Amendment was ratified, to Alice Paul and the National Women's Party, the next natural step would be an Equal Rights Amendment, right? And so they were the first ones to introduce the Equal Rights Amendment. Men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So once the 19th Amendment was ratified, this became the goal of the National Women's Party. There's going to be more on this a little bit later. Largely shut out from the formal political process, Black women in the United States during the 1920s also found opportunities to engage in political activity through predominantly Black religious institutions, the Black Women's Club movement, and they also had some leadership opportunities in mainstream civil rights organizations. So I have up there an example of an important Black women's club, the National Association of Colored Women. They're still going to be very active throughout the 1920s. There were women leaders in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and there were also women in Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. So in the 1920s, Black women hoped that suffrage would allow them to address issues such as Jim Crow, lynching, the disenfranchisement of their people. They talked about the sexual abuse of Black women, economic discrimination. So these are all goals that Black women had in the 1920s. And they sometimes acted in tandem with white women when they could, and I'll tell you more about that in a little while. But often they did some of this work on their own. So One of the organizations that a lot of people don't know about that formed right after suffrage is the Women's Joint Congressional Committee. And this was a really one of the promising political strategies of newly enfranchised women. And it was a total of 14 women's groups that joined to form this women's lobbying group to pass federal legislation backed by its member organizations. So I just have some pictures of some of the member organizations on there. On there, you'll see the League of Women Voters, the Women's Trade Union League, the National Consumers League, the General Federation of Women's Clubs, the National Council of Jewish Women, and the National Education Association. So these are just some of the big groups that came together to form the WJCC. According to one historian, the WJCC reflected, quote, an astute recognition of the growing importance of national associations' lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. So some have even pointed to this as a kind of a pioneering federal lobbying effort. Prior to suffrage, progressive era women and activists had worked mostly at the state level, but in the 1920s, they went to Washington, D.C., and they wanted to make change at the national level. The Women's Joint Congressional Committee evolved into a powerful lobbying force for the legislative agenda of more than 12 million women. And to the extent that the women's movement got anything done in the 1920s, it was largely because of the power of the WJCC. Critics and supporters alike came to recognize it as the most powerful lobby in Washington, at least for a little while. So to a certain degree, the fate and the fortune of the WJCC underscores women's political culture and what happened to women in the 1920s. In broad strokes, there were early achievements, and this sparked a reaction among big business and other conservative groups that challenged and ultimately limited women's programs. And so that's kind of the story we're telling in the 1920s, the story of promising beginnings and then coming up against external challenges and also some horizontal hostilities and problems. But through the WJCC, we can see this story. We can see initially successful ways women lobbied for social legislation. We can see the limitations and the challenges that they incurred and the enormous difficulties that women encountered as they were trying to expand public responsibility for social welfare. In many ways, the WJCC was the victim of aggressive attacks from opponents like the National Association of Manufacturers and other groups that tried to scuttle its agenda and was part of the shift of American politics to the right in the 1920s. But to the extent that there was a robust, I would call it more maternalist agenda than a feminist agenda in the 1920s after the suffrage movement. This lived in the WJCC, okay? They called for legislation, for example, supporting child labor laws, minimum wage, compulsory education, and maternal and infant health care, okay? So this organization is deeply rooted in progressive era women's activism and tried to leverage women's new political capital and power as voters with some tried and true politics of maternalism. By 1924, the Women's Joint Congressional Committee had national branches in 346 out of the 433 congressional districts. So you can see that they were exceedingly important. Well, However, to get to competing ideologies and horizontal hostilities, one group that wasn't part of the WJCC was the National Women's Party. Now, I realize, I know those of you out there, the hundreds of you out there, recognize this woman in this picture, and I understand that she is not from this era, but you know that that's Phyllis Schlafly, who was head of the Stop ERA campaign in the 1970s. Phyllis Schlafly ended up doing a good job, and I'm trying to make a historical parallel. There were a lot of people in the women's movement. In fact, most women's groups did not support the National Women's Party's Equal Rights Amendment. The women in the Joint Congressional Committee, the women in the General Federation of Women's Clubs, the women in the League of Women Voters, none of them supported the Equal Rights Amendment. So while in the 70s we associate opposition to equal rights with conservative right-wing women, in the 1920s, opposition to equal rights was really about maternalist women, social justice feminists, right, who were concerned that the Equal Rights Amendment would undermine the gains that women had made. And so without getting too much into the details of this, I just put Lochner v. New York and Muller v. Oregon, two important Supreme Court cases, on this slide. In Lochner versus New York, the Supreme Court struck down protective labor legislation for workers, and this was, kind of an echo of a conservative Gilded Age court in which free labor and liberty of contract were the most important precedents, right, of the court. They did not want the states interfering in what they considered to be liberty of contract. However, 3 years later in Muller versus Oregon, the Supreme Court reversed that decision at least a little bit because it allowed protective labor legislation, but the Muller case was about women and women workers. The Lochner case was about male workers. And in the Muller case in 1908, the way that they won the case was through the protection of women. In other words, the argument that the court made was that the state had a compelling interest in protecting the bodies of women in a way that it didn't have for men. And this was about protecting women's ability and potential to mother. Okay, so why I'm giving you that background is that now you can see that women were gaining protective labor legislation and men were not, right? So a lot of progressive suffragists who then became activists in groups like the Women's Joint Congressional Committee feared the Equal Rights Amendment. They feared that what would end up happening would be that through equal treatment, women would end up losing some of the safeguards that they had, okay? And so my graduate mentor, Catherine Kishklar, has a famous essay, and the title of which is something to the effect of, why were most women's groups opposed to the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1920s? So in this is just a great story that the NWP, the National Women's Party, thought to itself, we have the right to vote. What's the next natural thing to fight for? Of course, it would be equal treatment under the law in the Constitution. And 95% of the women's groups at the time said, whoa, no way. That's not the way to go. We think that that is actually a big mistake. And so the National Women's Party sort of stood alone in its fight for the Equal Rights Amendment, which again helps us to understand why we still don't have a ratified Equal Rights Amendment in this country. Okay, so now what I want to do is talk a little bit, if the NWP, the National Women's Party, and their ERA position represents kind of what we think of as kind of a classic feminist position, an equal rights position, what was really going on for a majority of former suffragists was that they were much more interested in what I've called maternalist politics, right? So I want to talk today about something you might know a little bit less about than the Equal Rights Amendment controversy, and that is the fate of Shepherd-Towner Maternity and Infancy Protection Act. Okay, so I have this suffrage poster up here to just remind us of the ways that maternalism worked for suffragists to make the case that women were going to make this difference, this important, unique difference in politics, right? And so the health of their children, food, schools, all the sort of traditional concerns of motherhood were then going to be taken up by women voters. And so when you think of it this way, it really makes sense that one of the first victories of the newly enfranchised women and of groups like the Women's Joint Congressional Committee was the passage of this Shepherd-Towner Act in 1921. This was the first time the federal government provided funds for healthcare in the United States, and it was for maternity and child and infant care. The Shepherd-Towner Act has been called the first major dividend of the full enfranchisement of women. So we're just going to talk a little bit about Shepherd-Towner, so I could tell you this, what I think is a really fascinating story. So when the House voted for Shepherd-Towner, it passed easily, 279 to 39. And ironically, the only woman in Congress who was an anti-suffragist, a woman named Alice Robertson, voted against it. President Harding signed the measure for the Shepherd-Towner Maternity and Infancy Act in November of 1921. And most people agree, most historians agree, that at this point, early in 1921, whether there was going to be a woman's bloc, right? Remember, like this gender gap in politics was unknown. People didn't know, politicians didn't know if they were going to be punished at the polls because suffragists had promised for years that they were going to clean house when they got the vote. And they claimed that they were going to be issue-oriented rather than partisan-oriented, right? So a lot of politicians feared that women voters would be able to cast a block vote, and this is why a lot of historians argue that Shepherd-Towner passed. The passage of this maternity bill was one of the first goals of newly enfranchised women, and some historians say that it took precedence over all other efforts. The Women's Joint Congressional Committee lobbied vigorously while all their constituent groups drummed up grassroots support, and they deluged Congress with a torrent of letters and telegrams and personal delegations. And any woman reading any sort of popular women's magazine like Good Housekeeping or McCall's or Women's Home Companion, those readers were exposed to many articles which favored the Shepherd-Towner bill. So it was really like an all-out assault. And I find this really interesting because so much of what we learn about women's politics in the 1920s is about the Equal Rights Amendment, when that actually was only supported by a very small minority of politically active women. The vast majority of politically active women were engaged in fighting for Shepherd-Towner. So these are just photos of the United States Children's Bureau and what they accomplished. The Children's Bureau was the federal agency within the Department of Labor that was going to oversee the Shepherd-Towner Act. The US Children's Bureau was created in order to investigate and report on all matters pertaining to the welfare of children and child life. And the first two issues that the Children's Bureau decided to take on were child labor on one hand and infant and maternal mortality on the other. Now, the Children's Bureau is interesting because it also was part of social justice, social welfare, feminists, maternalists who had been active in the settlement movement. Many of them were fierce maternalists who sought to transform what had had heretofore been women's private concerns, private suffering, private fears about their pregnancies, about the health of their children, and turn those private concerns into a national priority. So the Children's Bureau was created prior to enfranchisement, but in many ways, it was sort of at the peak of women's civic power. Through this unified message of maternalism, it was seen as a natural outgrowth of women's work and their kind of skill set. So with the passage of Shepherd-Towner in 1921, the Children's Bureau was going to design and implement a nationally coordinated effort to tackle infant mortality, and created right on the heels of the suffrage victory. It's been seen as a natural outgrowth of these maternalist efforts to promote social welfare, protect the vulnerable, and expand the responsibilities of the state. I just going to show you this one thing that I think is hilarious. The way that women lobbied for this, right? They really used their new power, right? How long are you going to let mothers and babies die? It asked legislators, and it was trying to call them out and shame them, and it was utilizing, their perceived expertise and perceived natural inclination to care about mothers and babies, and kind of using that as a bludgeon in the legislature. So the fate of Shepherd-Towner, though, it started off as something very exciting, victory of newly enfranchised women, a victory for the Women's Joint Congressional Committee and all of its constituent organizations. But by 1929, it was defunded, right? So it didn't even make it through the decade. So that's, I feel like, the fate of Shepherd-Towner and the fate of the agenda of the WJCC is instructive and kind of like a case study for seeing what went wrong and what happened in the 1920s. So it's an example of the initial hopes of newly enfranchised women and what turned out to be their dwindling leverage once this was revealed. It was also an example of women's maternalist agenda being undercut in an increasingly right-wing political environment. From the plain old conservative reticence that we still see today to spend federal dollars to flat out Red Scare paranoia and hysteria. Also, I'm going to offer an analysis that Shepherd-Towner also fell victim to what I call horizontal hostilities, as all women, as we are discussing, did not hold the same political or ideological ideas about how to proceed, how to best advance reform, and where to put their energies. So, some of you might have seen this before, but, oh wait, I want to go back and talk about sorry, excuse me. Oh, I want to talk about the American Medical Association. So the American Medical Association was part of the mainstream conservative opposition to Shepherd-Towner. From the Illinois State Medical Society, for example, here's an interesting quote. Today, Washington, D.C. is a hotbed of Bolshevism. Where will it all end? We all know where it ended in ruined Russia. Can the people of America set up a bureaucratic autocracy in Washington without a resulting industrial slavery? Okay. In 1922, the year after Shepherd-Towner was passed, American Medical Association House of Delegates condemned it as an imported socialistic scheme, right? And so the American Medical Association, which had been sort of part of the progressive agenda a little bit earlier on, they campaigned for example, Pure Food and Drug Act, protection of the public from medical kind of quacks. They had also lobbied for a federal Department of Health. So in some ways, the American Medical Association was seen to be part of this progressive coalition before suffrage, but after suffrage, they just worried that this group of non-doctors, non-physicians, these settlement house women in the Department of Labor were kind of getting involved in their territory, right? And were trying to nationalize medicine and healthcare. The Women Patriots was formerly the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, and they also argued that Shepherd-Towner was not, well, how do I say this? Shepherd-Towner did not accurately reflect women's desires, that this was just kind of a feminist block of women. For example, one of the Women Patriots said, "There are many loyal American men and women who believe that this bill," referring to Shepherd-Towner, "inspired by foreign experiments in communism and backed by the radical forces in this country, strikes at the heart of our civilization." Okay, and so these are the ways in which conservatives right away begin to attack what was really the premier agenda item of the newly enfranchised and organized women. Some of you who live in Massachusetts might be interested to know that it was in the state of Massachusetts that spawned the most organized effort against Shepherd-Towner. And the opposition of the medical profession had been very vigorous, particularly in Massachusetts. And they said a lot of the same things that they said nationally, but this is the beginning of communism in medicine, a vicious, un-American, paternalistic bill. This is a step towards socialism. And when the Massachusetts state legislature started considering Shepherd-Towner, the Massachusetts Attorney General issued an opinion that it would be a misuse of tax money for Massachusetts, and therefore it was unconstitutional. So Massachusetts filed a suit with the US Supreme Court on behalf of taxpayers to oppose Shepherd-Towner. So this is some of the opposition that they face. And here we see a visual representation of what progressive maternalists had to grapple with in the 1920s. This is the infamous Spiderweb Chart. And it initiated many accusations of red accusations. It was a red baiting chart that the Daughters of the American Revolution originally created and promoted to attempt to discredit this women's lobby that was trying to promote a progressive agenda. When the Women's Joint Congressional Committee, they had to investigate the source of this chart because it was published and then it was republished, and it was something that people were talking about. It links the names of leading women reformers, and then I tried to highlight some of the boxes for you, because of course you can't really read the chart, but it's great to see the whole thing because it's trying to basically show a political conspiracy, right? But when you zoom out and you can look at some of those boxes, you see the General Federation of Women's Clubs, the National Federation of Business and Professional Women, really a hotbed of socialism, right? The Women's Christian Temperance Union, for goodness sake, right? So, I think this Spiderweb chart shows what the Red Scare and the paranoia around socialism did to women's maternalist agenda. Whereas prior to suffrage, there had been anti-suffragists, but before women actually got power, they were not seen as a threat to the American way of life, But now they were being accused of really being threatening. And so the women's group that organized this was a small group, but it was vocal, and they begin to influence sort of more mainstream right-wing women's groups like the Daughters of the American Revolution, who then kind of take up and hold up the banner of anti-Shepherd-Towner, anti-Women's Joint Congressional Committee. So that might be a story that sounds somewhat familiar, right? You have left-wing a progressive social welfare agenda, and then you have right-wing critics, right? But one thing that I want to add to this story is the story of how the American Birth Control League and the burgeoning birth control movement in the 1920s also offered its own critique of Shepherd Towner. So this is something that I worked on many years ago. I got very interested in why in the United States there were sort of separate movements for birth control, or what we call today reproductive rights on one hand, and maternal and infant welfare, or what I would call reproductive health issues on the other. Whereas in other industrialized countries, these organizations really work together. In the United States, particularly in the 1920s, they really, in many ways, undermined each other and undermined each other's agendas. So one of the reasons for this has to do with the fact that what was happening in places like the Women's Joint Congressional Committee and in legislation like Shepherd Towner was that maternalists were trying to turn government attention towards social welfare. They wanted a more activist government that would take responsibility for the social welfare of its most disadvantaged citizens. Now, at the same time, birth control reformers, and I put up just a couple of quotes up there on this slide, were actually insulting legislators. They were trying to pit legislators who they thought were, idiotic and adolescent and prejudiced, and and pit them against the forces of science and medicine and modernism, okay? And so that is sort of how things got started on being on the wrong foot. So the Women and the Children's Bureau are trying to work with legislators. They're trying to work within the system to get Congress to pass and fund these social welfare measures. Meanwhile, women in the birth control movement are seeing the government as tyrannical and are trying to basically get the government off of their backs, okay? Now this gets specific when they begin to critique Shepherd Towner. So basically, in a way, the birth control reformers are aggravated and frustrated that the Women in the Children's Bureau are trying to work on things like infant and maternal mortality, and yet they will not advocate birth control. Right? And the birth control activists are so frustrated by this because they feel like it's a no-brainer, right? If you're worried about things like infant mortality and maternal health, then as the first quote says, you have to go to the root, right, of improving this problem, which requires the clean-cut acts of prevention. And I love this line, infancy protection locks the barn door after the horse is stolen, right? So for them, it's a little too little, a little too late, right? But it gets worse, right? So this quote comes from the Birth Control Review, which was the journal of the American Birth Control League. In 1921, the same year that Shepherd Towner is passed, right? 2 years into Shepherd Towner, as it's fighting for its life, right? Because every year the Appropriations Committee has to decide whether to continue funding it or not, right? And this person in the Birth Control Review wrote, if a nation decides to spend its money on feeding bottles and napkins, diapers, right, it will not have to spend it on the finer enjoyments of life for adults. We must remember that these children who are so liberally cared for contribute nothing on their part to the state, right? So, I mean, it doesn't sound all that different from a sort of a traditional right-wing critique of social welfare legislation, right? And then in the last one, America has built an elaborate and expensive service for prenatal and postnatal care with no provision whatever for regulating the size of family in accordance with the health of the mother, right? So here is, just this insight that Shepherd Towner can't really work without the complementary reform of birth control. So birth control activists had made this strategic decision that they were going to promote the legalization of birth control through an effort to get doctors to be able to prescribe contraception to their patients, okay? And so they are working with people in the American Medical Association, right? They're working with the people who have come out against Shepard-Towner, right? They're also trying to make a case that birth control is cheaper and more effective and more efficient. At the same time, the women in the Children's Bureau are like holding on with white knuckles and hoping that Shepard-Towner is going to keep getting funded. So this just set these two groups of women who both cared about maternal and infant welfare on a completely different trajectory from one another. For the women in the Children's Bureau, who were implementing and administering Shepard-Towner, birth control remained totally absent from their program because, quite frankly, they thought that it was sort of going to become an albatross around their neck. They knew it was controversial, and they wanted to keep things sort of quiet and mainstream and not press anybody's buttons, right? But really, if you think about it, right, this is a little bit surprising considering that the Children's Bureau had a consistent commitment to exploring the broad elements involved in infant and maternal mortality. And the results of many of the Children's Bureau early studies showed, among other things, that family size correlated with infant survival, right? And that infants born after a 2-year interval had almost a 50% better chance of living than those born after a 1-year interval, right? So it was as if they were ignoring their own studies, right? Which you would think, if the political situation was different, would have moved them to not only support things like Shepard-Towner that were going to create visiting nurses and do some education campaigning, but would also have supported birth control. But that basically never happened, even though women all over the country wrote to the Children's Bureau from its inception, asking them about birth control, asking for information about it, about how to space their children, how to stop from having children, and they never responded. They basically never wanted to touch it. It was like the third rail in politics, you know? So here were birth control activists dragging down Shepard-Towner. Here were women sort of sitting pretty in the federal government, not grappling or working alongside of the birth control movement. And to me, this is a really, really important example of why things couldn't get done as effectively as people would have hoped after suffrage. Okay, and then a couple more just examples of this that I want to give. And one is that I think sometimes we forget that when women were enfranchised, right-wing women were enfranchised as well, right? And so many of you know that the 1920s was a moment where the Ku Klux Klan was revitalized, and actually women, the Klan was actually bigger in the 1920s than it had been in the 1870s, and it spread all over the country. And the Klan had many millions of women in its organization, and the women of the Klan saw themselves as protecting sort of true womanhood and the things like what they called 100% Americanism. They were suspicious of the liberal goals of the women's lobby, like the WJCC, and they were equally, obviously, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a sec, hostile to Black women's demands for equal suffrage and citizenship. So the mobilization of right-wing women in the 20s was a product of, you know, xenophobia and racism, but it was also combined with kind of maternalist or gendered notions of preservation of family life, and even in a weird way, I know this is going to sound really strange, but women's rights in some strange way. So I'm going to use this example of this recruitment ad for women of the KKK. and I tried to highlight some of the things that I thought were interesting about it, right? To the American women of Washington, are you interested in the welfare of our nation, right? So this could be something that the WJCC had written, right? As an enfranchised woman, are you interested in better government? Again, you don't get that this is going to be a Klan thing yet, right? Do you not wish for the protection of pure womanhood? Okay, so that could be your first clue. Shall we uphold the sanctity of the American home? Should we not interest ourselves in better education for our children? Do we not want American teachers in our American schools? It is possible for organized patriotic women to aid in stamping out the crime and vice that are undermining the morals of our youth. The duty of the American mother is greater than ever before, right? So I love this recruitment ad because it just hits all of those notes that we've been talking about, right? And we're thinking of, motherhood and the duty of motherhood and the education of children, and what can newly enfranchised women do to make the nation better, right? And we see the Women's Joint Congressional Committee having one answer for that, but we need to understand that there were a bunch of white women in the 1920s who had this kind of answer to that question of what newly enfranchised women could do. So my last example of problems in the 1920s, I'm going to talk just a little bit now before I finish about how Black women kind of fought back and how they operated in this kind of really dynamic and sort of competitive and rivalrous and complex system of women's politics in the 1920s. And so one strategy Black women could do in fighting back was to work with, or try to work with, national women's organizations, which were predominantly white. And actually, Professor Cahill, who some of you saw her talk a couple weeks ago, she wrote about African American women. Specifically, in her book, she talks about African American women lobbying the National Women's Party, right, the NWP, to put their disenfranchisement on the NWP's agenda, right? So they want the National Women's Party and Alice Paul to make a real commitment to the 19th Amendment that they had fought so hard for, and wanted the NWP to investigate violations of the 19th Amendment, right? And that seems like a really reasonable, I mean, the NWP, these were the women who had picketed outside the White House, who had gone to jail for the amendment, who had hunger struck for the amendment, right? And so here's a bunch of women from the NAACP go to the National Women's Party and they say, okay, well, this amendment isn't exactly working out for all of us. We'd like you to investigate violations. And what they found was that Alice Paul was not at all interested in what they had to say. They called her hostile, and she worried that if she adopted Black women's sort of program of working on disenfranchisement in the South, dealing with white racial terror lynchings in the South, that this would do nothing but inflame white Southerners, right? So she was more worried about how white Southern women would react to having to work with or have an agenda that included Black women's interests than she was about the fact that the 19th Amendment was not really working out for Black women in the Jim Crow South. So here's just this part of this great story that I love. This woman from the NAACP, her name was Addie Hunton, and she called on African American women to send a flood of letters and telegrams and to come to Washington, D.C. to make their case. And Hunton says this was a wonderful opportunity to push the National Women's Party to protect the amendment which they fought so hard to have passed. We must make them recognize that it included the 5 million colored women in this country. Okay, and so in a brilliant political move that I loved reading about, the women of the NAACP decided that if Alice Paul refused to listen, they were going to picket at the NWP conference to call attention to the flagrant violations of this amendment and quote unquote, give them a taste of their own medicine, right? The National Women's Party eventually agreed to meet with a delegation of African American women. This is when they call her hostile and unmoved. And Alice Paul ends up saying to them, your issues, that's a race thing. We're a purely feminist organization. We're a purely women's organization. We don't get involved in these other issues. And so they were basically put off. In a slightly better, well, much better story, African-American women had more luck with the League of Women Voters than they had with the National Women's Party. And the League of Women Voters actually passed a resolution right in 1921 to create a commission, which is what they wanted the NWP to do, to study and help remedy, as far as possible, the violations of the 19th Amendment and other wrongs to which colored people are subjected, right? So this was, sort of, here are these two big women's organizations, these post-suffrage organizations. One of them wants to have nothing to do with Black women's problems, and the other one is agreeing to at least put them on the agenda. Black women don't just go sort of begging for inclusion in white women's organizations. They also work within their own organizations to try to promote their particular Black women's agenda. And for them, I like to show this because they used, again, maternalist language and used their unique positions as mothers to draw attention to the issues that they cared about. And so in particular, this is in reference to the Dyer anti-lynching bill, which was passed by the House in 1922. It moved to the Senate and it failed to pass, and it kept failing to pass and kept failing to pass. And that's like a whole other story. But I wanted you to take a look at notice the language that Black women are using to call out terror lynchings. What would you do if your sick mother were hanged and her bones burned? We mourn as mothers whose sons might be lynched, and we protest the burning of babies and women, American cannibalism, right? So this was Black women's use of maternalist politics to try to get things done. And if we count the anti-lynching bill as another example of what newly enfranchised women were trying to do, that's another example of a failure. I want to end today by offering you something a little bit more, a little more inspiring, and I want to end on a success story. So this is a little known incident. In 1922, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, newly enfranchised United Daughters of the Confederacy, decide that they're going to dedicate a monument to what they call the mythical Black Mammy of the South. And they actually get people in Congress, white Southern people in Congress, to take up this cause, right? And a Southern congressman stated in support of this creation of this monument, the traveler, as he passes by, will recall that epoch in Southern civilization when fidelity and loyalty prevailed. No class of any race of people held in bondage could be found anywhere who lived more free from care or distress, right? So this monument is absolutely, we could talk a lot about Confederate monuments, but we don't often know, I haven't heard this story about this monument to mammies. It's all part of the lost cause narrative. It's all part of this, retelling this myth about happy slaves in the South. W.E.B. Du Bois rightfully said, about the dignity of the mammy, any dignity that she had was stripped away once the children she raised went on to lynch her sons, right? So W.B. Du Bois just cut right to the chase. And then the National Association of Colored Women, that had been around since the pre-suffrage days, takes this on and they win, right? They derided the hypocrisy of white Southerners, and they suggested that white Southern women's energy would be better spent interceding with husbands and fathers to stop terror lynchings, as opposed, instead of raising monuments to happy enslaved women and perpetuating that sort of mammy myth. So the good news here is that the bill died. We don't have a mammy monument that I know about anyway. And so this is in some ways a small victory amid what I have been describing as an increasingly kind of frustrating political environment for both Black and white progressive women in the 1920s. So I just want to end by saying that we have to assess this as kind of a mixed legacy. And when we think about the impact of suffrage and we think about women reformers in decades like the 1920s, we have to understand them rather than celebrate them, that's a really important part of learning accurate history that can really help us grapple with the racial reckoning that's going on right now, and also the fact that women still don't make up enough of our elected officials, right? So we want more voices to offer a more nuanced picture of the past. Continually new scholarship upends what we had thought were established truths, and so we want to keep understanding that history is dynamic, that every new generation of scholars will ask new questions and open up new sources and get us to see things in ways that we hadn't seen before. And lastly, I'll just leave by saying the women's work or the work of the women's movement is never done. And I'm very happy to end there, and I'll be delighted to take your questions. Thank you.
Oh, that was absolutely amazing, Robyn. And there have been questions and comments coming in, but as we said before, if you'd like to take about a 5-minute break now, just for those people who want to stretch their legs and otherwise. And also in the interim, I would still encourage everyone to put your questions and comments in the chat. And I'm sure that Professor Rosen will get to as many as she can. By my clock, it's now 2:33. So if we say 2:38, and we'll start up again, if that's all right with everyone. And that's great. So we'll look forward to hearing from everyone and getting those questions answered. So thanks to you. We have more questions than, well, no, we don't have more than we would have expected. This is Ali after all.
Exactly. So. We talked about that. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. I'm going to try to do these in order, and I'm sure people will let me know if I've missed anything. So,
okay.
Starting out, when you were talking about the women's, okay, I have to look and see.
I know there were a lot of acronyms and a lot of organizations that I mentioned.
No, it's all great. When the Women's Joint Congressional Committee, that's what it is, was formed, were there very many women in Congress? And this is from Louise Frankenberg.
Oh, thanks, Louise. That's a great question. Oh my God, I had like 40 more pages of notes that I didn't get to. And I promised them that I would only talk for 45 minutes, but I talked for an hour. So I apologize, but I tried to give you my best stuff, But anyway, in 1925, I have just a couple of stats that are in my notes. In 1925, out of 7,500 state legislature seats, women held 150. So that's just one statistic. So 150 out of 7,500. And by 1930, there were 13 women elected to Congress. So this is after this whole decade that we've talked about, but half of them, I learned, were temporarily filling in for vacant seats. So this whole question of, or promise or threat of a woman's bloc or a gender voting bloc really doesn't happen until the 1980s. Right? That's really the next time that people start talking about the gender gap in politics, right? And it's happened again now with Trump. It kind of went away a little after Reagan, and now we see it back. But basically, it starts in 1980, and it's a response to the second wave of feminism. So great question. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And Larry and Gail Volk want us to know that today the League of Women Voters supports the ERA. So let it be known.
To follow up on that story, this idea that most women's groups were opposed to ERA in the 1920s, this began to change as labor legislation for men got better, and women stopped worrying that equal rights would mean less rights for them, right? And that their rights would devolve down to men's rights, right? So as the labor movement gained strength by basically, and Eleanor Roosevelt was one of those women who was against the ERA because she was part of this whole maternalist crowd. These were all her buddies, right? And by right before her death, like starting in the 50s is when a lot of the women's groups start saying, okay, ERA, you know.
Well, better late than never, right?
Exactly.
Let's hope. Okay, Barbara Stock is asking, did the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire have a major impact on mobilizing women to fight for rights in the workplace and the ballot box?
Absolutely, yes. So one of the groups in the Women's Joint Congressional Committee was the National Consumers League, and that was headed by Florence Kelley, who was the first woman factory inspector in the nation, right? And so this is what a lot of the settlement house movement women were working on women's labor rights. And child labor and class. Like they were all interested in class legislation, not always as good on race as we've seen throughout these 7 weeks, but very, very committed to protective labor legislation. And absolutely the Triangle Factory fire helped, motivate them even more for those kinds of reforms. But again, this would be the kind of thing that would also make them more worried about ERA as well.
Yeah. Can't win them all, right? But
Right.
so Louise is asking, did Shepard Towner cover Blacks in practice?
So that's a great question. Actually, historians, it's hard to study a thing like Shepard Towner because it was implemented by states all over the country, except for Massachusetts, which refused to be involved. So basically what it was is it set up federal funds, kind of a matching grant, we would call it. Oh my God, they're mowing my lawn right now. Can you believe it? Sorry about that.
That's okay.
It's very loud. They would set up matching grant for states to allocate some money for these funds. And so Shepard Towner looked different wherever you were. So there would be mobile, baby units, and there would be visiting nurses. So my guess would be, just like most things in the Jim Crow South, people were going to be less concerned about infant mortality in the Black community. And I'm guessing that Black women didn't have as much access to its programs. However, the Children's Bureau publications, on a federal level, I think the Children's Bureau did better. But because it's implemented state by state, I'm guessing that we would see the same racism that we saw in all of those programs.
Okay, thank you for that. There are a number of questions on the KKK, but I'm going to save those till a minute. Frank Farkas was asking if you could say a few words about who Shepard and Towner were.
I saw that, and I don't know much about them, but I know that Towner was a Republican from Ohio, and Morris was a Democrat from Texas. So, back in the day when there was actually bipartisan legislation, but again, I would guess, though I really don't know the answer to this, I would guess that these were people who had been lobbied by women's groups in their own states and had decided that this was a good bet, that who was going to be again, who wanted babies to die, as the women said. And so it was one of those seen, at least initially, as kind of low-hanging fruit in this new political world where women might make an impact at the ballot box.
Great. So our very own Kate Kidd is asking, why do you think these arguments of socialism have had such impact and ability to undermine positive changes and continue to have an impact?
Oh my gosh, yeah, if I knew the answer to that, I mean, I guess in the 1920s, it's like, if you think about, as a historian, I think to myself, when do they resonate the most? They resonate the most when the global climate changes, right? So in the 20s, it makes sense because you have just had the Bolshevik Revolution, right? In the 1950s, it makes sense because the Soviets detonate the bomb, and the communists win the civil war in China. And so at each moment of our sort of Red Scares in American history, there have been at least some like actually realistic reasons why people have feared, revolution, and then of course it's used as it's weaponized. The fear is then weaponized and leveraged by conservative politicians who don't, just basically don't want to spend money, and so you basically have an alignment of sort of the true believers, and then you just have the people who are benefiting from it because it suits their political agenda to call, health, healthcare like Medicaid or Medicare, socialism, or to call Social Security socialism, or to, just fill in the blank.
Right. So on the subject, oh, I hope that's okay. On the subject of medical issues, Frank Schaberg wanted us to know that the American Academy of Pediatrics was formed in 1930, splitting from the AMA to address the needs of children and mothers. And then there's another point here from Charlotte, who said, actually, I'm going to ask it as a question. She said she's sure that, like now, anti-birth control was influenced by religious beliefs. Do you feel the same way?
Yeah, I mean, when the people who the birth control movement felt were their biggest obstacles, it was Roman Catholics. It wasn't really evangelical Protestants in that period. That's because it really isn't until the 1930s that conservative Protestant sects begin to really grow. So in the 1920s, it's mostly Protestant and a few Jewish women in the birth control movement. And it's the Catholics who show up at all these hearings to fight against it. Absolutely. But it's also women who are attracted to right-wing organizations who just think of birth control as, it's going to upend gender relations, it's going to ruin women's purity and morality, and who wants to buy the cow when you can get the milk for free, that kind of, that way of thinking about sexuality, right? That was a big tension in the 1920s between the more modern, younger generation and the more conservative, older generation.
Interesting. We're talking about right wing. So now coming back to the KKK, Dale Fink mentioned that D.C. Stevenson, the grand dragon of the KKK in Indiana in the 1920s, said, "I am the law in Indiana," quote unquote. Fortunately, he was eventually put away for many years for kidnapping and rape.
Oh my God, we love that story in history because, here are these like moralistic, despicable human beings, right, who say that they want 100% Americanism and they are fighting for the purity of American womanhood, right? And then they're just always involved in these sex scandals, and in Indiana, that's a great point to make because, I mean, I referenced it just really quickly that one of the big differences in the 20s to the 1870s, the first incarnation of the Klan, is that the Klan was all over the country, and Indiana, New York, Oregon, I mean, these were like big Klan places, Michigan. So it was no longer just this Southern organization.
Well, on the subject of the KKK, Kate is asking, she's saying that many of these quotes from the KKK that you had shared could be taken from a right-wing ad today, or that, as a question, why have these attitudes persisted and what can we do to address these misconceptions?
Oh,
do you have a few hours?
Yeah, really. I mean, one of the things I've recently been studying is related to this. I'm really interested in what happened with abortion rights in the 1970s and with the ERA and kind of the rise of the right wing in the 70s. And one of the tactics they used is very similar. That's why I showed that picture of Phyllis Schlafly holding that cute baby, stop ERA, don't give my mother any rights. That would be terrible, right? So, but what they do is they kind of promote this notion that whatever the left wants to do, it's putting families and children in danger. So think about anti-busing rhetoric in the 70s, oh, your little white daughters are going to have to sit next to Black boys at school, or anti-gay rights, gay teachers are going to molest your children. Like, it was always sort of this like children in peril. And I mean, I don't know if I'm really answering Kate's question, but I've been thinking about this a lot, like, why does it resonate? And it occurs to me, and one of the points I wanted to make today was that the suffragists and the progressive women are kind of using that stuff too, right? Like they're talking about, we want to be better wives and mothers, and we want to help the baby. Like, so everyone's trying to leverage that sentimental, narrative about mommies and babies, and it's just, I don't know why sometimes the right wing is just better at it than the left.
Okay, so there's some other, well, actually, I'll say this one next. Jesse Waldinger said, said the Dearborn Independent was the publication of Henry Ford and was a notorious anti-Semitic organ, and he's wondering if the Spiderweb Chart referenced Jewish groups as well.
You know what? It's very hard to read. Not that I noticed, although I wouldn't be surprised, since the National Federation of Jewish Women was a member of the Women's Joint Congressional Committee, that like if they weren't directly named, they were sort of indirectly named in that sort of group,
I like that group.
Well,
okay.
Yeah, really, we'd all want to be in that group. Well, there's a great article, an old article, and the title is All Pink Sisters. And it's all about sort of these pink, like how women were red baited, but because they were women, the historian made the argument that they were sort of called pink sisters, It's like, go pink sisters,
Okay, then. All right. And then Karen Curley is asking, what was the impact of the Depression on the movement?
So the Depression actually helped some of what we would call the progressive maternalists, because basically with the creation of the welfare state, finally, right, the government did begin to assume responsibility for public welfare in brand new ways. And often in these new bureaucracies of the New Deal, women found jobs, right? So whereas steel plants were closing in Pittsburgh and coal mines were shutting down, women were actually getting these new sort of white collar jobs through the 1930s. The other thing that I'm interested in that I talked a little bit about was that during the 30s, the birth control movement starts to gain some traction. And there are some court cases that begin to allow birth control being administered or prescribed by doctors to their married women patients. So it's a little baby step, but it's a little bit of progress. Also, the KKK, as someone said, kind of falls apart by the late 20s. So that's helpful. And Eleanor Roosevelt being in the White House is very also helpful to the Black community. So we do see some gains in the 1930s, even though FDR will not support the anti-lynching bill, because he also doesn't want to inflame the white Southerners, just like Alice Paul in the National Women's Party.
Yeah, there's an interesting question. I'll get to that after. But so Mal Wasserman is saying, a marvelous and very surprising presentation. Thank you. She has a question, though. To what extent was the birth control movement, particularly Margaret Sanger's organization, influenced by eugenics ideas, reducing the number of immigrants and other quote unquote undesirables?
Yeah, unfortunately, absolutely was. The way I like to think about Margaret Sanger is to not, she used eugenic rhetoric strategically. So do I think Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist deep in her heart? No, I don't. I've done a lot of research on Margaret Sanger. However, she used eugenics in the same way that she sort of tried to butter up the doctors and to say, don't you want to be able to prescribe birth control to your patients? Why don't you come sit at this, congressional hearing with us? We're trying to help you people, right? Like she had been fighting for birth control for decades. And I see her use of eugenics as opportunistic, and I would call it slightly superficial. So it's not that she didn't say some horrible things, not really a lot about race or immigrants, but more about, and I'm going to use the term that morons, that like people would talk about IQ and feeble-minded people, and women who had inherited diseases. So she did use this rhetoric, particularly when it was at its peak, when they were talking about eugenics at Harvard, and the eugenics scientists were the most popular and important scientists of the day. So it's not that I am, I don't want to feel defensive about the birth control movement or Sanger, because they've certainly made their mistakes, but I also don't think it's fair to pin something on them that was part of the mainstream dialogue. And this is the way people spoke about things. I mean, remember the 20s, I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but this is not only the decade of the revival of the KKK, but it's also the decade where the immigration quotas, racialized immigration quotas come to be. Racialized immigration quotas are based on racialized science. And so Margaret Sanger is speaking the language of the day, I guess would be a way to say it.
Well, since you brought up birth control, there are a couple of other points here. Naomi Spates says, didn't the Supreme Court duck the birth control issue in the 1930s?
Well, what happens is that there's the U.S. Appeals Court, right? The Circuit Court of Appeals. I can't remember. There's a case in the 30s called U.S. versus One Package, and it was a package of Japanese pessaries, and basically it was a test case, and it was a package of basically pessaries, what they call pessaries, what we would today call diaphragms, that were sent to a doctor, and they were confiscated because it was illegal. And the case went up through the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. And basically that is the court case that said what I said before, which is that doctors were exempt from these anti-birth control bills. So that these anti-birth control laws, that a doctor could prescribe birth control to generally his patients if they were married, and that would not undermine the prohibition against birth control. It was considered, obscene. But doctors became exempt from that in the 1930s.
This is a different tack now, just getting off of birth control for a minute. Karen Curley has a question asking, are we as women just destined to infighting? Is this just politics, or is it intrinsic to woman on woman behavior? And if so, what is the hope in progressing? Personally, I don't think that it's women on women or just women, Karen. I'm going to say that, but certainly I'd like to ask the expert, Robyn. So,
I mean, I'm not a psychologist, right? I mean, I can tell you that the moment before women got the vote, that was the moment that they, in some ways, peaked in terms of their sort of political power, which is weird to say because, it was more of just like sort of, I would call it civic power, this idea of what they could be, and the unifying goal of suffrage. That was probably the most unified women ever were, and ever since then, we've kind of split along all of these ideological, regional, class, ethnic lines, and I don't see why in some ways, the whole question of maternalist politics, or the question it asks us to think about is there anything intrinsically unifying about being a woman, that why we would expect women to behave differently than men in politics and to somehow get along better, or understand each other, or not undermine each other. I mean, I don't see that much evidence of that. So, but maybe I'm a little cynical. I don't know.
I think that's fair. Nancy wants to know, what percentage of women in Congress were filling their dead husbands' seats?
Well, right. I know that a lot of those. I don't have the number in front of me, but I did write down that of the 150. Of the 13 women. Wait, where did I see this? Yes, of the 13 women elected to Congress, half of them, I guess it says, were temporarily filling in for vacant seats. So I don't. I'm sure some of those. Most, all, I don't know if those vacant seats were their husbands, but I don't know for sure.
Interesting. Naomi wants to know, did the Supreme Court 1908 decision on limiting women's working hours based on the Brandeis brief play any role in the various women's organizations?
Yes, absolutely. I didn't get to tell the full story, but certainly that became the Mueller and the Brandeis brief which again was based on this social science, but also kind of this maternalist vision that women sort of deserve to be protected, their bodies deserve to be protected by the state in ways that men's bodies don't. And that absolutely set women, the majority of women's groups, on this course of not looking for equal rights, but looking to use this wedge, right? Okay, like we got this victory, right? So let's use this wedge and go in this direction to try to continually seek more protection for women workers, right? And so that I think Muller is hugely important in 1908, because if it hadn't been for Muller, it's possible that most women's groups in the 1920s would have supported an equal rights amendment. Right? But it was seen as dangerous for that strategy that they began to employ ever since the legal victory in Muller. So it's a great question.
Shirley is asking, Gloria Steinem said that the idea that Phyllis Schlafly wasn't the force that stopped the ERA. Let me read that again. Gloria Steinem said that the idea that Phyllis Schlafly wasn't the force that stopped the ERA, but it was more the insurance industries. Can you comment on that?
I don't know. That's a good question, but I'm not sure. I'd like to hear more about that. I'm not sure how the insurance industry fits into the Stop ERA campaign, but I'm fascinated by that. I'm going to look that up afterwards.
Okay, well, you can get back to us on that. And
okay.
Just because I see that we're not quite done, but I see that people are starting to leave. There are a lot of thank yous and great presentations, and it certainly was, Robyn, so thank you for that. But I just wanted to let everyone know before you all sign off that you will be receiving a course evaluation survey via email, and we're please asking you to complete it, and it'll help us to plan for future programs. And again, before everyone signs off, and then we'll get back to the couple of questions still there and more coming in. I just want to thank Megan, Andy, and Ray of the OLLI office for their help and support. And I do want to give a shout out to my fellow University Day committee members, Will, Brian, Kit, and Bernadette. And I especially want to give great thanks to our fearless leader, Catherine Kidd, who never gets to hear anybody say that. So I'm saying it for all of us. And of course, we appreciate everyone who has shown up. And there were several hundred people on this call today. I just want you to know. But you did a wonderful job for all those several hundreds. And just coming back to the questions, again, I just want to make sure everyone knew to fill out the survey you'll be getting. Abby is asking if you could recommend a book about the Jim Crow era and women. Is there something specific to that? You're muted, Robyn.
I was trying to stop the lawn mowing. The historian that I'm really interested in lately is a woman named Keisha Blaine, Keisha Blaine. She has some really interesting stuff that I didn't get a chance to talk about women's activism in the United Negro Improvement Association, which was Marcus Garvey's organization. But let me think about that. I'll put together a little list because I'm, just like at the moment, nothing is coming to mind other than her name, and I don't even remember the name of her book. So let me do a better job with that, and I will absolutely put a list together.
Okay, no, that's great. Let me see. We're getting all these wonderful thank yous. People have loved the series, which warms our hearts, of course. And people are appreciative of you getting back to us with that list. And Kate has said that Keisha Blaine is also one of the editors of 400 Souls. So there's a start. And again, I want to thank you for this amazing presentation, and also for being our humanities scholar for this project. That we couldn't have done it without all of you, and again, in particular with you, Dr. Rosen.
Thank you. It was an honor. I was delighted to be the closer. It was really, really an honor to do that. It was an incredible course. I was so impressed with everyone's presentations, and
you did a great job of pulling it all together for us, which we really appreciate. So thank you for that. Unless anyone has any last questions, I'm seeing all the thank yous. It'll take us a few hours for all those thank yus, but if you have a question, well, we're actually over the 3 o'clock time limit. So thank you for sticking with us for that. And again, this has been terrific, and we hope to see all of you soon. So
Thank
thanks,
you.
Doctor. Take good care.
Take care.
Bye.